it's looking grand out here, and it's grander because you've met Wanjiru already, and you are re-meeting her. This time, she's not going to talk about libraries, but about her book in a library. And so, this is her debut novel, The Havoc of Choice. And I received a soft copy, as you have to stylishly call anything that comes as an attachment. So I received the soft copy, untouchable, but readable. So, having read it, I was deeply impressed by the fact that when I read the first few pages, and here is a woman running away from home, I thought this was the usual social novel about interpersonal dysfunctional families and lifestyle, midlife crisis, and things like that, which has become so cliched. But then it's an entirely different novel, and it's a novel which tells us about where she's from. Kenya. The one time I had the advantage of reading novels like this was when I read Chinama Adichie. And because I was in the Commonwealth Writers' Prize and we chose it for a prize. So here was another, and this is about Nairobi. And it is about a different language, like Swahili. That's the language you use. So, for me, it was such an opportunity. There was no plan that Shiny would ask me to meet her. But for me, it's a long connection when I sort of locate Adichie and Wanjiru together. And so I would like to just ask you as a first question, and you have visuals also for us. Would you like to show it first, or would you like to get into the questions that I have for you based on your text?
There's another mic over there. Thank you. Let me just first say that it's incredible to have my name in the same sentence as Chimamanda. Chimamanda is my queen. She's the reason I'm a writer. So thank you for that very warm compliment. There's a cover. The cover of the book is available on the screen. I guess you can put that on and off as we go. But I forgot your question. Oh my goodness, I forgot your question. Oh,
This is working? Is it working? Okay. So we are so keen to have us ourselves heard, as you notice. Yes? So the question that I had for her is what I'm going to read out because I did some homework. Yes? And this is, I've asked her that your novel has fictionalized a most traumatic phase in the recent history of Kenya. Was it difficult to write a novel that is based on recent local history? Because there is a notion that you need to use magic realism, you need to use a sort of metafiction so that you don't identify what's happening. As you know, in movies also, they will say none of the characters should resemble the people that you are able to identify because it's all fictitious. So, would you like to distance yourself from that, or would you think that you are addressing local history in terms of the trauma, in terms of what you lost, and also what you gained from it?
that's an incredible question. Thank you. I think the best way to answer it is to explain why I wrote this book. So when I moved, I went to grad school to write the book. I went to Cape Town in South Africa. And as soon as I would say that I'm from Kenya, people would be like, oh, shame. How are you guys doing after that election? And I'd be like, we're fine. Like, we accepted and we moved on. And this is maybe 5 years after the election. It is 2012. So I kept getting this question, how are you okay? And it is from South Africans who have a history of trauma. And of course, we know about the history. So for them, it sounded very upset that I would be saying we're good only 5 years after the worst violence we've ever had happened. And when I moved to Cape Town, I went to write a book about my father because he just passed away and I couldn't live in Nairobi anymore. And I wanted to write this big memoir that would honor him in a big way. But then the idea of the election and the trauma and the way the city changed after the election became real to me. So I wrote this book because I don't think we're okay. It was very difficult to get over the imposter syndrome, being a woman, a young woman in Nairobi, tackling politics, and we politics hard. Everywhere we politics hard. So the hardest thing was to actually get over the imposter syndrome and be like, they're older, more qualified people to write this book. And I think that's why I took the lens that I did, because the thing that means the most to me is family. So telling the book through the lens of the family made it a little easier to talk about this very difficult, very traumatic time in our history. And there's a really important scholar, her name is Dr. Joyce Nyaru, who in 2009, 2 years after the violence, said it's gonna be 10 years before we can begin to process what has happened to us as a country. And before we can begin to have our writers and our artists explore the violence. And it has been 12 years since the violence. And I think she was right.
All right. Now, if it was so difficult to write, which would you identify as more difficult part of your writing? Was it the contextual part, or was it the more personal story that you create in order to situate the context? Which was difficult, the local history or the fact that it is about interpersonal relationships that become fractured, fragmented, absolutely splintering, which came to you easily and which came to you in a way in which you had to do a lot of research?
the the personal stuff was difficult because the election was still very fresh in my mind. I was in Nairobi during the election, and my biggest inconvenience during living in Nairobi in 2007 was that I couldn't go to the liquor store to buy a bottle of gin. True story, and this is after the world was burning, like Kenya was burning, people had lost their homes, were getting killed by their neighbors. But in my part of Nairobi, I couldn't go to the liquor store because the supermarkets were closed or they were empty. So the factual bit of the novel was easy because it was fact. It happened, and I remember it very vividly. The characters, though, kind of trusting and forming these people and making them as nuanced enough to tell the story and tell it properly, that was difficult. I can't believe that like my agent signed me when when she read the first draft, because it was nothing close to what it is now, because a lot of work went into making these people whole and real, and also having them go through this thing that was so traumatic, again having to relive it on the page again and having to sit with for 7 years kind of thinking about this violence that had then passed, but you have to bring it back onto the page. That was difficult, and I think I did a good job. I think I did.
All right. So, yes, that's very interesting. And that you also refer to the fact that you couldn't go and buy a bottle of gin. Out here, we don't really have to have a civil war to prevent women from not going to buy a bottle of gin. We are lassi drinkers when we verbally state it. Yes? So, in those words, I think we are thinking in terms of cultures in contrast, where, of course, when again we think that your inheritance of the English language and the Western culture has been very much a part of the English language and Western culture in which we grew up. Especially, I'm sure there are many who have studied English literature and internalized it to the extent that you knew poems in English by heart. Yes, which of course the post-colonial critics have always criticized, as your Kenyan writer does, Thiong. Yes, so we are looking at similar cultures because we come from the colonies where we have inherited, our minds are colonized, culturally colonized. And at the same time, we are also looking at our own ethnic cultures. And what post-colonialism has done for us is to be able to fuse this harmoniously. The English language, Western literary tradition, as well as our strong rooted ethnic traditions. And this becomes obvious if you have a chance to read her novel, where she has used a lot of ethnic words, many Swahili words, but among them, for me, what was fascinating was a reference to dhania. I thought, oh my God, what is this? Dhania seems something I can understand so easily without looking for the glossary. And there was also kachumber. So I would like to ask you how ethnic words in an English narrative, whether it makes a reader stumble because of the unfamiliarity of the words, or do you think it lends a flavor to that writing which makes it unique?
I definitely think that when done well, it adds flavor to the work. And I have a lot of English and Kiswahili and Kikuyu words because I speak 3 languages, and most Kenyans are multilingual. And I think the only regret that I have about this particular novel is that we italicize the non-English words, which is the norm. It's a trend and it's what people are doing. But what does it say about the value you place on our languages? So and for my next books, I'll stop italicizing Swahili words, because if you do it well, you don't have to. People know English words, so you don't have to kind of draw out the non-English words in italics, because then you're othering other languages. You're kind of giving English its position of power and giving our languages kind of secondary status. So I think that we must put as much language in our books as we can. And as long as you're kind of paying attention to the fact that, yes, it'll be read by Kenyans who speak these languages, I think there's always things you can do on either ends of those words to give context without having to italicize them, because we have, I think, given English too much prominence.
Yeah.
And it's important that we call it what it is. So I wish that we'd stop othering our languages, because they're all functional languages that we communicate with most of the time. We barely speak socially. We barely speak like proper English in Kenya. We speak a lot of Sheng, and all of these languages have kind of blended into one. So they should on the page as well.
That's right, because uh, uh, in the past, say 8 to 10 years, there has been a lot of buzz about the fact that multilingual literature departments should yield place to world literature departments, which is a much more inclusive reading of world literature than reading literature of one particular location. Like those of us who studied English, from Beowulf to Chetan Bhagat, yes, have been exposed to just one type of writing, mostly urban. And so I think it is very crucial now to open up and understand literatures written in various languages through a process of translation if writers are unable to use the English language readily. And there again, we talk about Thiong, because linguistic imperialism is something that I think we cannot support in a world which is about inclusiveness. Because raising one, diminishing the other, destroys cultures, as it is destroying many of our ethnic languages, as you know, and our regional literature, our regional languages are suffering very much for this. As you know, parents speak to their children now in English mostly, because that's the easiest way to be able to nurture them in a language that parents feel will make them introduced to a pan Indian audience as well as to the world. So, is it the same experience in Kenya, or are you very proud of your own Swahili language and the other more classified one like Kikuyu?
Yes, we have 42, actually another 43 languages in Kenya, 43 tribes and 43 languages, and some of them are different dialects of the same language. And there is a pride. I mean, we're very tribal, and the violence that I spoke about was triggered by the elections, but it was actually a tribal war between Kikuyus and Luos, because the people who were running for elections came from each of those tribes. So it was 2 tribes fighting against each other, and everybody else was kind of like the casualty. But we take a lot of pride in our languages. I dare say even a little too much, because of the polarizing that it does. However, we are taught English in school. We are taught in English all through our curriculum of education. We learn Swahili as well. I wish that schools would teach the ethnic languages before they taught French and Spanish and German, which is what most schools are doing now. But there's definitely a pride to our languages that is very, very kind of almost violent, to be honest. Kikuyus are known for being like shrewd business people and also being thieves. Luos are known for being, and it's all things that are not even like based on anything other than the anecdotes. But there's definitely a pride in our languages. And as you say, Ngugi wa Thiong'o has been the largest advocate for writing in your mother tongue.
Yes, he talked about eliminating all the English departments in Africa. But then there's always the question that 2 Africans will not be able to understand each other if they come from 2 parts of Africa unless they speak in English.
True.
Similarly, here, If you speak to me in Kannada or Malayali, I should have learnt it, but I haven't. Yes? So we need to have a common language. And I think the English is that common pan Indian language that we have, and it is totally caste free. So I would endorse that English, probably not being Sanskritized, is a safer language to handle in these troubled times. So, and the, why I'm harping on the language is not because I have not prepared well on her book, but because the book addresses the issue of language. So I will vindicate my stand on language. And now, would you like to show this, or would it be right at the end? Oh, okay. We don't. Okay. So now I would request our author, Wanjiru, who has come all the way from Kenya, to read from her own writing, because that will give us a direct flavor of the author's voice and the author's text, as well as the author as text as she sits here.
Thank you. I will read a section. The main character in the book is a woman called Kabata, and her father is a politician. He's been a politician all of her life, and she's lived under his shadow for so long. So then, when her husband decides to run in the election with the party that her father was part of, she leaves him. And in this section of the book, we're exploring kind of Kabata's history with her father and what it was like growing up under her father's shadow. Kavasa often tried to explain the complexities of growing up with a father like hers, but each time she only succeeded at sounding like an ungrateful brat. The Honorable Mutinda Muli was quite the politician in his day, the quintessential man of the people, charming, generous, and outrageously corrupt. Kavata suspected that most, if not all of his wealth, was acquired from fleecing Kenyans faster than they could say serikali. For instance, the house she and her family lived in was a wedding gift from her father and was likely purchased with hard-earned taxpayer shillings. He spent his life paranoid that someone wanted his blood. He was always ready to flee. He refused to open a bank account or to carry a cell phone or to set up an email address. The phrase, the guilty run when no one is chasing, was probably inspired by Honorable Muli. His constituents loved him, and those who didn't respected him. He was the longest serving member of parliament for Machakos constituency, a feat he took great pride in. And his tenure in office had turned him into a master crook, a corruption connoisseur. Coming to terms with the fact that her father was a dishonest man was somewhat of a journey for Kavata. As a little girl, she knew it was wrong for him to send her out to tell his visitors that he was not in the house, when indeed he was sat in his study with a robe and slippers reading the newspaper after his mandatory mid-morning nap. Too ashamed to play outside under the glaze of her father's impatient audience, Kavata would often stay indoors all day, daydreaming and counting the minutes until her father went to work. Then she would put on her sandals and run out and squeeze whatever time she could of the afternoon. And sometimes she would catch her father's guests' faces as they were speeding off in his chauffeur-driven car without a glance in their direction, and she wondered how he had the heart to do that. On some days, she would only get to go outdoors for a couple of minutes before the national anthem played in the kitchen radio, telling her that it was time for her evening bath. In primary school, her classmates would often reiterate what they heard their parents say about Honorable Muli, that he was deceptive and unjust, that his generosity was steeped in greed, and that he stood for everything that was wrong with Moi's government. She didn't understand these words at the time, but they still stung. When she was 12 years old, Honorable Muli orchestrated an elaborate scheme to redirect the resources intended to dig 400 wells across Machakos, which is one of the more arid areas of Nairobi. The wells were dug, indeed, 25 of them, scattered across the town. And then he selected a group of young community leaders and mobilizers and paid them well to organize events all over the city to open up the water sources and declare Machakos an oasis. He ensured that the local newspapers printed photographs of women and children fetching water from the new taps and serving it to him to taste. They smiled for the cameras while pretending not to see the bottled mineral water that he was actually drinking from. He encouraged journalists to write articles about how much development he'd brought to Machakos, complete with statistics about the region and what it would gain economically from its new sources of water. And as a final precaution, he paid a surveyor to fabricate a detailed document claiming that it was only those 25 locations in the whole of Machakos that had water underground. This report recommended that additional water be channeled from Nairobi to every house in his ancestral homeland so that they would have running water. To achieve this, he'll need more money. And finally, to dispel any doubt about Honorable Muli, he commissioned a second analysis which said the same thing as he siphoned his millions into bank accounts in Seychelles and Liberia. Should I go on?
As you notice, politicians are similar everywhere. Yes?
They must go to the same school.
Yeah. Probably. And that is such a classified area in which they work, because somehow the politicians' way of thinking would never occur to us till, I suppose, we don that garb of being a politician. Immediately, I guess something changes, because we generally are unable to believe that somebody you knew so well could act so differently. And I will not go into the particulars, and you don't have to go all the way to Kenya to understand that. Yes? And so, and so what I also noticed about the novel is the fact that the woman who, within the first few pages of the novel, leaves her home as a form of protest against leaving home as a form of protest against a husband has become a common theme, as I pointed out. But this is about a very, very powerful achiever father, and also an immensely respected and recognized politician. And to be successful, the father was capable of turning everything upside down, and which meant business deals, real estate, and everything that you did not attach with politicians' domain at all when you think of the earlier politicians like Gandhi and the others. I cannot remember any of the politicians of colonial times messing around with real estate. You might have some examples, but I personally, my knowledge is very limited. I do not remember anything. But here, in order to remain this dominant force, this involvement with crony capitalism is so much a part of the novel, as you will see. And the husband of this woman is lured by this power of the father in law. So the husband and the father in law become a sort of buddies. Of course, there's a lot of sameness and difference in that getting together. But that a married young woman with her own children, but pretty young, is able to express so much of reservation, if not repulsion, towards the way her father has been successful. Was it difficult to write that? Is there a sort of overwhelming respect for the father figure as we have in our culture? Because not too many novelists really write about fathers' failure to perform in a way that you would consider to be much more respectful in nature.
That's a good question. I actually didn't struggle at all because there were so many people and archetypes that kind of resemble Mr. Honorable Muli. And I also come from a political family, so I understand the pressures to... My father wanted to run for office and my mother said no. She's like, I did not marry a politician, you're not going to do this. So I think it was very, very clear to see, at least for me, to draw those parallels. I have mad respect for my father and his peers, but in this case, the people who are plundering the country, the people who we've trusted, called the fathers of our nation for so long, have been doing nothing but plundering our country. So it wasn't difficult. I mean, this book hasn't been read by anyone in my family yet, so I can answer that question again next year. And when they do read it, they're gonna be things that they recognize from our lives, because we were kind of in the shadows of politics, still all of our lives, and which is why it made it very important for me to write the story, because while I might not be the right age or the right gender to be telling a political story, I think I have some kind of insider information. I mean, no one in my family is in politics now, but they have been in the past. And there's so much tension between the private and the public, the political and the family, that we've had to navigate, that made this very it just kind of flew out of me. But there's definitely things that keep me up at night. I wonder what the reception will be, given that I'm speaking about politics and have the last name that I do, and that will obviously open up a whole can of worms that to be frank, I'm ready for. I'm ready. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. So the time manager has already pointed out 5 minutes in a very determined way. And so I will open this up for just 2 questions. 2 questions. Keep your questions short so that she can answer.
The election that you're referring to is the one between Uhuru Kenyatta and Raila Odinga. That's a time when a massive...
It was Mwai Kibaki and Odinga. Yeah.
Okay. So that is the time when that massive violence took place in the slums outside Nairobi. That was the time when that violence took place in the slums outside Nairobi. Now, I think Uhuru was actually called before the ICC, the International Criminal Court, to appear for the crimes. How do you assess that? Who was responsible, and was Uhuru responsible, and how did he get out of it?
Oh my God, such a difficult one to answer. So just to be clear, this election was between Mwai Kibaki and Raila Odinga, but Uhuru was implicated in the violence, and he got off. As most of the people who were implicated, he got off from the ICC scot-free, which I think is a big disservice. There was definitely intimidation of witnesses that happened, and that what hurts me deeply is that he was implicated, but is still the president of the country today. I don't know in what world that is possible, but I think that the way that the violence in the election has been dealt with globally, from the court point of view, from the way we're dealing with the trauma of it, because Kenya has not been the same since that election. When elections come around the corner, we all freeze. Sometimes I want to leave the country, because it's such a toxic and suffocating space to be in. And it's because we haven't addressed '07. So I think that's what I hope this book will do, to begin to remind us what happened so we can actually address it properly. Otherwise, I can guarantee it will happen again.
Yes.
Do you have a plan for another book on the same lines, on the on
you have
politics?
To make this, because there's a third one and we have to finish.
Okay. Because it's really interesting, and I feel like following your books for the next books and so on. So that's basically my question.
Okay. I want to write 2 more books before I can do politics again. I want to write a love story, because there's not enough African romance. So that might be the next one that I write. And then I also want to write about my father, because he's influenced my life so greatly. And it's a book I intended to write then, but I wasn't ready to do it then. So before I delve into politics, I want to write those two next. We don't have any African romance, and I don't know who's inspiring us to love on that continent. So that's what I want to do next.
Okay, just time for a very short question, like a telegram.
Sure. So I was wondering how influential Ngugi's writing has been as you grew up. Did you grow up reading his? Because he's the greatest political novelist from Kenya.
Incredibly influential. We read Ngugi in school. My father forced us to memorize Ngugi. And he and I have met a few times since, well, obviously in the last few years, and he's somebody I respect often. He's somebody whose approval I low-key really hope to get. I haven't written in English, so of course I'm sure he'll be disappointed in that, but he influences not just me, but I think a lot of the writers in our country very, very greatly.